A geomorphic covariance structure, as we have defined it, is the spatial series of the product of two standardized geomorphic variables along a river. This is how we originally defined it, but I would also just generalize it to say it's the relationship between two standardized geomorphic variables along a river corridor. In other words, the product is a pretty handy function, as you'll see in a minute, to look at how these things go together. But there's other kinds of relationships that are maybe better depending on what you need. Now, let's just think a bit about this terminology, because we're scientists and we are a little bit semantic and pedantic. The word covariance already has a well-accepted meaning in statistics. It is a specific expression of math that leads to a single number. So if you take two series and you compute the covariance, it is one number. However, throughout science, we see many instances where a word is used in one case, but across different disciplines, means very different things. I mean, the word force, it can mean all kinds of things depending on what you're doing. Pressure, we often see adaptation of words for different contexts. So we came to the conclusion that we like the word covariance because it includes covary. It's like, how do any two things covary down the river? That's what we're interested in. Now, we're geomorphologists, so we're focusing on geomorphic covariance, but recognize, as we have, that it's not limited to geomorphology. I mean, I don't know, it could be environmental covariance, but then someone's going to come up with something sociological. It doesn't matter. It's just, you could have any two things down a river corridor. It could be, it could be crime rate, it could be wealth and poverty, it could be anything. And you could see how that creates a structure with anything else. That's the thing. So down a river, there are many geomorphic covariance structures. And so examples could include all kinds of data. It could include basic topographic variables, as I've been showing you, like bed elevation and width. It could also be centerline position or curvature. It could also be channel asymmetry. It could be any kind of metric you want to extract that ties to a physical process. We can also have hydraulic variables. And I said width before, but width requires a specific discharge to say it's the width of that thing. But it is geomorphic if you just say like bankful width or valley width or something like it. But in any case, you can have the top width of any discharge. You could have bed roughness or bank roughness, water depth, velocity, shear stress. You may also have topographic change detection analysis, where you have scour and fill volumes, and you could look at how those vary, as we published in a paper in 2014. Or you could look at other things like vegetation, habitat, biomass, stream wood, whatever you want, and sociological things. However, what I want to emphasize, and it's going to be important in this presentation, is that there's a particular process called topographic steering that primarily involves the geomorphic covariance structure with detrended bed elevation and width. And so I'm going to be focusing a lot on that. So let's look at the literal product. Let's go back to our original definition of the geomorphic covariance structure, and we'll define this variable C, covariance, equals the product of two standardized variables, detrended bed elevation and width. When we multiply those together, it's a little bit dicey, but the number can either be positive or negative, right? If bed elevation is positive and width is positive, you get a positive value. Unfortunately, if bed elevation is negative and width is negative, you also get a positive. So there's a particular pairing of things here that creates a positive number, and an inverse pairing of things that creates negative numbers. But one of the things you can see straight away from the Lower Yuba River example is it's almost always positive. And that is no accident. That's a result of the governing process at work here. Where there's a place that's negative, it doesn't mean that the river is wrong or faulty. It could be natural. It could be a result of forcing that's there. So without getting into the details yet, this just gives you a taste of what a geomorphic covariance structure looks like. And again, this is discharge specific. So now, in order to interpret this, the best way that I've found I mean, we can just, well, basically it's essentially you need a decision tree. A simple decision tree is to just do what I already told you, which is like look for positive or negative numbers. And those would then be associated with, different processes. However, we're going to have a little bit more involved thing here. And so this is then work that I layered on top of Rocco's work. So Rocco got us to these covariance structures, which is really cool. And then I took it there with then creating a classification of landform types that I'll be showing you next. So this just reminds us that we're going to be back into the building block framework from that continuum approach. So let's think of different kinds of landforms. Imagine that you have a pipe that's relatively wide, and then it constricts into a narrow pipe and goes back. We would use the term nozzle to describe this section of smaller diameter pipe. We don't really have a term for the opposite, so I invented one. Nobody likes it, honestly, but I like it. It is what it is. You come up with a better one, you let me know. Put it in the comments. If we start with an one size pipe and we go to a bigger pipe, I call it oversized because in all dimensions it's just bigger. It's over the average size. The idea of topographic steering, this is a technical term from fluid mechanics, but many of us in geomorphology have stolen it and made it our own. We mean literally when you have a change in topography that forces the fluid mechanics to change in response to that change in topography. We call that topographic steering. And so, in a nozzle, you could imagine that is a constriction of everything. What is that going to do? Well, if you take a discharge, you put it into a smaller cross-sectional area, you're going to increase the velocity. For oversized, you're going to decrease the velocity. So now let's look at how this would play out in a river. Rivers are not pipes, they're open channels. You can see in this photo from the Yuba River that the water is flowing from left to right, and in the downstream area is what I would call a normal U-shaped channel, which has about the average dimensions for the river as a whole. So I'm going to call that normal as just being the regular size river. Basically, it would be a river with vanilla attributes. Maybe I should call it vanilla, I don't know. From there, you come upstream and there's an island here. And at base flow, the majority of the flow is funneling into this nozzle. It's a place that's both narrow and shallow. So the water is ramping up and constricting, and you can see this little rapid that's being formed here that has this horseshoe shape that's funneling into a nozzle. At the far upstream end, it's too big to fit in the photo, but we have an oversized cross-section that's both wider and deeper than the normal channel. So I've now shown you 3 geometric shapes that we can use as basic building blocks: normal, nozzle, and oversized. These 3 terms have no specific scale, like the term particle, like the term bowl. They're scale independent. Whereas if I say gravel, of course, we have a convention that gravel is, 2 millimeters to 32 millimeters or something like that. If we look at the same site, but we go from base flow to a flood flow, we see that the location of these 3 landform changes. All 3 of them are still present. But now, where before we had a normal channel downstream, this now is essentially acting as a significant constriction. We can see that far downstream here, the water has not gotten out past this vegetation, so the water has to constrict. On the other hand, where we had this small nozzle, because of the presence of this island, there's a very wide extent here, and so now the river is actually oversized. It's very wide and deep. And although this upstream area was deeper, it is now narrower, and so on average it's closer to the normal conditions compared to this other one here. So we can see that at 2 different discharges, we have a nesting. At low flow, we have one pattern of these basic building blocks, and at another flow, we have a different one. So in this case, we have like a nozzle at base flow nested within an oversized floodway, for example. There are 2 more landforms that complete the story. These are wide bar and constricted pool. A wide bar like nozzle has a high bed elevation, but it's wide. Constricted pool, like oversized, is deep, but it's narrow. And so you can have an alternation like this, and I can't show this in a pipe, obviously, but here's a photo from the real world of a place like this where I've tried to show the bank in orange and blue. So the wide bar is very wide. In fact, it's so wide that this has become a very stable thing, and there's vegetation growing on it. But then that funnels down to a narrow pool that is downstream of that. So this is the last two of these landforms. These landforms are not arbitrary. Not only are they geometric, but they actually play a role in a very important process that I spent a lot of time in my career studying that has been termed flow convergence routing. And for this presentation, I've been trying to give credit where credit is due. There was a PhD student at Stanford named Michael McWilliams, and he was working on the same thing that I was working on with my undergrad student at the time, Joe Wheaton. And he coined this term, flow convergence routing, and I really think it's a remarkable term. The essence of flow convergence routing is simple. Wherever the cross-sectional area of a river is smallest will be the focus of scour, all other things being equal. Wherever the cross-section of the river is largest has the potential, it's going to have the least transport capacity. Let me rephrase this. So wherever the cross-section is the smallest will have the highest transport capacity, and the highest shear stress. And where the cross-section has the largest area, it'll have the lowest shear stress and the lowest sediment transport capacity. Where I got tongue-tied there is there's no guarantee that scour will take place at the lowest, at the highest, the smallest cross-sectional area. And there's no guarantee that deposition will occur in the largest cross-sectional area. But that's where the potential is. You also have to factor in that there could be a difference in slope between these locations, and there could be a difference in grain size or roughness. So there are other factors that could come into play that could defy that. In other words, if you have a riffle that is a very small cross-section and it has a very high sediment transport capacity, but if it's all armored with giant boulders, nothing's going anywhere, so it's not going to scour. But nevertheless, geometry is a very, very powerful control on geomorphology. And one of the things that happens is that we can define the hydraulic mechanism that wherever the cross-section is smallest, you have that funneling, that nozzling of flow. And so that is the flow convergence. Flow convergence is the hydraulic part of this mechanism. Flow converges into the small cross-section and diverges into the large cross-section. Routing relates to the sediment transport mechanism. That is, that routing will take place. Sediment will be routed through the area of smallest cross-section, as well as scouring may also take place there. Now, this mechanism was envisioned to go with a specific patterning of river, and that is what's shown here. That at low flow, the small cross-section takes place on a riffle, essentially making a riffle into a nozzle. And then the pool is oversized. So at low flow, you have nozzle oversized. And so, even if the whole landform of the riffle is a wide bar at a higher flow, but where the water is, it's relatively narrow. And so this pattern of convergence, divergence, divergence, it does not lead to self-sustainable topography. However, what happens in some rivers is that if you do have a wide bar where the riffle is, then at high flow, it gets very wide there. And that's exactly what we saw here, that at low flow, we have this nozzle, but you have the wide bar in the cross-section. So at high flow, it can spread out across that. And you can actually have a decrease in velocity with increasing discharge because the cross-sectional area can be growing so much. Now, you may not have that. You may just have velocity. Velocity may be increasing with discharge, but the rate at which it increases could be slow. Whereas in the pool, if the pool is confined at all by like a point bar, then as discharge increases, it's not getting a lot deeper, and it's not getting, it remains confined. And so as a result of that, its velocity skyrockets, and you get what we call velocity reversal. So flow convergence routing was envisioned for a specific pattern, a pattern in which at bankful discharge you have a wide bar alternating with a constricted pool. So water is converging in the constricted pool, and that routes sediment through the pool and to potentially deposit on the next bar. This is what makes this topography self-sustainable, is that if you have sediment supply coming from upstream, it can't really deposit in the pool because of the flow convergence that's taking place there. And so it gets routed to the riffles. If the riffle has gotten wide enough that it can then enable deposition because the sediment transport capacity isn't high enough and the sediment supply is high, then it will deposit. Whew, boy, I'm getting tired. I don't know about you. Let me have a drink of water. If I were you, I would pause and watch this slide again, like a couple times. I will just say that my understanding of this concept has evolved some away from requiring a specific locking of this pair of topographies into just saying that in general, wherever the cross-section is smallest, you have the potential for scour, and wherever it's the largest, you have the potential for deposition. And by characterizing the landform types over a range of discharges, you can infer what is going to be taking place. So again, let's just summarize these two key concepts. Any situation in which the location of smallest cross-sectional area is moving around as a function of discharge is exhibiting the hydraulic process of stage-dependent flow convergence. So in other words, in here, the smallest cross-section went from the riffle to the pool. It moved. So any situation in which this location of smallest cross-sectional area is moving around up and down the river as a function of discharge, then you have stage-dependent flow convergence. Meanwhile, we expect scour to occur in the smallest cross-section and the potential for deposition in the largest cross-section in all cases. So that's the stage-dependent routing part of it. If we look at a river, back on the Yuba again, well, this isn't in press anymore, but anyway, in this paper from 2017, my colleague Peter Chinchilla and I showed that, as you go up in discharge, you might have a place that is initially relatively wide. Like, here's a relatively wide place at 300 CFS, but it could be relatively constricted at another flow. Here the valley is quite constricted at the highest discharge, and here the valley is relatively wide at the highest discharge. Here's a place where it's very, very narrow at low discharge, but it may be the widest of all at the highest discharge. So for sure, cross-sectional area is going to be varying down the river, and that sets up the possibility that you can have flow convergence routing taking place. Let me show you an example of actual morphodynamics with flow convergence routing on a river. This is unpublished data from a project I did as a consultant on the lower Feather River. I made hydraulic models of the river at a base flow condition, relatively low discharge, and then I made it at a flood flow. The main difference you can see is at a high flow, there are these peripheral channels that become activated. So at low flow, we have these very high velocities of 2.5 to 3 feet per second, so about, what's that, 0.75 to 1 meter per second. And that's the riffle at low flow. And then downstream of there, we have a pool that's present. You can't see the depth here, but trust me, there's a pool there. Then we come to the flood flow, and notice that the velocity on the riffles decreased from 2.5 to 3 feet per second to 1.5 to 2 feet per second. So truly a decrease in velocity. This defies classic hydraulic geometry nonsense. Like, you can decrease velocity as discharge increases through the increase in cross-sectional area. This is the essence of what this is all about. On the other hand, the pool cross-section, it did increase its velocity with increasing discharge. So how did this affect morphodynamics? Well, what I can do, I'm not going to do it on a cross-sectional basis. I'm going to do it on a morphological unit basis, We applied a decision tree to identify riffles and pools based on their base flow locations, and then we looked to see what happened with deposition and erosion. So we begin with topographic change detection and analysis. I believe we applied some amount of spatially explicit uncertainty analysis here, but this is already a while ago. And the fact that you have white areas means we did. Anyway, you can see that initially, even at first glance, you can see deposition here in the riffle and then erosion in the area where the pool is. But when we look at it mathematically, you can see the change in elevation over this 14-year period from 1999 to 2013. The riffle grew by 1/2 foot and the pool eroded by almost 2.5 feet. So you have almost a 3 foot or 1 meter rejuvenation of riffle pool relief. So we've confirmed here, first hydraulically, there is a stage-dependent flow convergence hydraulic mechanism. At one discharge, the smallest cross-sectional area is here. At another discharge, it's at a different location. And of course, you're not going to get a lot of scour at low flow, so the riffle can remain intact, probably somewhat armored. But then when you go to the high discharge, because of these peripheral channels, there's a lot of extra width. And so the velocity, the flow is being diverted, which decreases the conveyance over the riffle and decreases its velocity. So this example from the Feather River showed us flow convergence routing as a fully functional morphodynamic mechanism. It's not necessarily the only mechanism in place. Obviously, you have those peripheral channels, so there's avulsions that have taken place, and there's some amount of minor meandering here. But it shows that it works. And my former undergrad and master's student, Joe Whedon, published a paper we all co-authored together in 2010 about the Mokelumne River, where we showed that we could literally design flow convergence routing into a river restoration project, and it led to the same kind of rejuvenation like you see here that actually improved salmon spawning habitat on riffles. So it's a very controllable morphodynamic mechanism. Let's return now to the basic building blocks for those 5 landforms I was talking about. I put 4 of them on the view here: nozzle, oversized, wide bar, constricted pool, and then the 5th is normal. Now let's try to understand what the combinations are for our continuous functions. So we have detrended width that could be low or high, and we have, did I say detrended? I'm sorry, standardized width. And then you have detrended standardized bed elevation, which it too can be low or high. So let's play the game. Let's start over here. If the bed is high, that means depth is low. The bed is high and it's narrow, we have a nozzle. So if we go here, we get high and narrow, or high and low. So we have a positive value and a negative value, means that when you multiply them together for covariance, you get a negative value. Similarly, if you are oversized, you're low. Now you have a low bed elevation because you're deep, and you're wide. So now we have a high width and a low bed elevation. Negative times positive, when we make a product of those two numbers, is going to give us a negative. As you can see, oversized and nozzle are the 2 negative covariance landforms. Now let's come over here. If we're wide and shallow, so that's a big width and a big bed elevation. And shallow we think of as small depth, but we're here in terms of bed elevation. A high bed elevation, high width, positive, positive, that's going to make a wide bar. And then constricted pool, we have a low depth and a low width, negative, negative. When you multiply those two numbers together, they too are positive. In other words, the product of bed elevation and width is diagnostic of whether you're alternating between wide bar and constricted pool or nozzle and oversized in your sequences. So you could have riffle pool, riffle pool, riffle pool, but whether they're wide bar constricted pool variety or oversized nozzle is entirely dictated by this covariance. I just want to check something here. Okay, I'm just going to go way back for a minute, back to here. So now if we look at this function, you should have the ability to interpret this. You should recognize that in the simplest way, if I'm above 0, I don't know what the landform is. It's either constricted pool or wide bar, but it has to be one of those two. And this is for base flow, but it tells us that if we're at a flow where sediment transport can take place, which is probably at least bankful or higher, then we have a chance for self-sustainable morphology because we can have flow convergence routing, keeping our pools cleaned out and depositing material onto the riffles. On the other hand, if we had predominantly negative numbers, then we would be in a situation where you had nozzle and oversized. This river only has one substantial nozzle oversized situation. In this case, it's probably oversized, and it's just a very, very large pool. In fact, it's probably the largest pool on the river or something. Anyway, okay, so let's flash forward again. Now, as you can see, the choice to make a product between these two numbers has a big disadvantage because you can't identify the individual landforms that way. You can only just see whether you're a positive or negative covariance. So instead, we could make a decision tree classification. Okay, in a decision tree classification, we would want to identify normal as having a range of width, which is the x-axis, and I don't know why the numbers aren't here, but the y-axis here would be bed elevation, like detrended standardized bed elevation. So we have to specify a threshold value in units of standard deviation, and then within that range around 0, we're going to call that a normal channel. For the moment, I've chosen the value 0.5. You may, if you want to be super conservative and have a lot of normal channel, choose 1 standard deviation. If you want to see a lot of variability, choose a very small number. This is something that you can tune when you're looking at your spatial series, and I don't really want to emphasize that now. So for a moment, let's just assume this 0.5 number. We can create a decision tree that says when both of these are negative, it's constricted pool. And this is now the color scheme that I'm going to be using here on. That constricted pool is blue, positive, negative is oversized, and then black, wide bar is going to be orange, and nozzle is going to be red. We haven't found much use of it yet, but you could even go to a full 9-unit classification, which allows one variable to be average and the other one to be abnormal. So you could have just a constricted channel or wide or shallow deep, but otherwise normal. I haven't done much research with those 4. We've played with it a little bit, but the main interest so far and what you need for flow convergence routing are these corners. Well, this diagram's hardly readable, but this is the workflow. If you want to see this workflow, I'm pretty sure we published it in our 2018 paper. In this case, you begin with a wetted area polygon for a given flow. So this is our workflow if you assume that you already have 1-dimensional or 2-dimensional hydrodynamic modeling that gives you a wetted area polygon. We have a separate workflow that we haven't actually formally published. It's the paper's in revision right now, so if I stop procrastinating and get that revision done, it'll be out shortly. But anyway, you can do this without any modeling. You can just do it all with detrending and taking horizontal slices. Anyway, if you begin with some representation of a wetted area of a river, then you can use that to, from that wetted area, you can create a center line down it. Why are we using centerline instead of Thalweg? That's a whole nother debate, but the main reason we're using the centerline is because we don't want to have cross sections that are going to get so contorted for a tortuous river that they cross back and the cross section is running down the river. Generally, we take the wetted area and we bifurcate it perfectly with a centerline, which is a function you can do in GIS pretty effectively, create a bisector of a polygon. We can then station that in length. Okay, what are the intervals? That's also talked about in the paper. I don't remember the number off the top of my head right now. I'm getting tired. But anyway, so you station that at a very high frequency. You then create cross-sections lines along those cross-sections. You turn those cross-sections into boxes. So like, let's say you space them every 3 meters. You have a line every 3 meters down the river. You then buffer that by 1.5 meters on both sides, so you get a 3-meter box centered on each station. That, in addition, you must have a gridded DEM. From the gridded DEM, you create a longitudinal series of the bed elevation, and you also create a width series. So these cross sections then give you a width series. From the boxes that you have here, we can extract the average elevation across the whole cross section. I don't want Thalweg elevation. We want the cross-sectionally averaged elevation of the whole thing. Why? Cross-sectionally averaged elevation is much more representative of depth than Thalweg. The Thalweg elevation is the maximum possible depth. Okay, so we have our elevation series. We calculate the mean elevation. We go through the detrending process. I've already showed you that process. Similarly, you have the width series. I showed you this kind of like from that Happy Canyon thing, but I didn't work through it in GIS. Anyway, you get those series, you multiply them together. If the absolute value of this, okay, now for each cross section, or each cross-sectional box, I should say, is the absolute value greater than 0.5? That's our threshold. If not, it's a normal channel and you're done. If it is, you go into the decision tree, you look at the directionality of these signals, and you get either oversized, nozzle, constricted pool, wide bar, which in GIS we assign different numerical values to for analysis purposes. So that's the overall workflow. I'm blowing through it a little bit because I'm kind of getting tired, but that gives you the idea of it. So do we find that in fact, as discharge increases, locations that are these different landforms show the hydraulic convergence and divergence we anticipate? The answer is yes. This shows results from the Yuba River from our publication that for each, so I have a two-dimensional model of velocity for the whole river. It's like 34, 35 kilometers of river at 1 meter resolution. And at any one discharge, I identify the locations where each of these landforms occur. Once I have that, then I query to see what is the 95th percentile velocity for each one of these landforms. So at the lowest discharge at base flow, you can see that the normal channel, or just normal, is in gray, and so it's the reference point as you go increasing in discharge. Now I want to be clear that as I go from one discharge to the next, I'm not holding my location constant. What I'm doing is that at each discharge, I'm identifying where the landforms are at that discharge. So a base flow normal channel, a bankful normal channel, and a floodway normal channel may be at 3 different locations. But for that type of landform at each flow, I'm calculating the 95th percentile velocity. So you can see that relative to normal channel, nozzle is always higher than that, and oversized is always lower than that. That's what you would expect. In other words, it's stage independent. No matter what the stage is, you're in that situation. On the other hand, for a wide bar and constricted pool, it's not stage independent. Wide bar, on average, starts off a little bit lower, but it's pretty close. And then we get this big divergence. So bankful discharges here where I'm circling at about 141 cubic meters per second. Once you get above that, we start to see that wide bar it actually even slows down a little bit, but the rate of velocity increase has slowed. And so wide bar ends up being as slow as oversized. Conversely, constricted pool starts off slow. It accelerates beyond normal and then stays about there. But again, once you get above bankful, it starts to really accelerate and diverge, and it eventually even gets faster than nozzle. So in the overview of it, constricted pool and nozzle are essentially your erosional landforms, and wide bar and oversized are your potentially depositional landforms. However, there is a little bit of a fluke here that constricted pool shouldn't necessarily be higher than nozzle. And I'm confident that's because in these results, we're taking the product of covariance as a product, which means you only have to cross the threshold. It means you could have a very deep pool, but if it's just narrow enough, then it will show up as a constricted pool. Or it could be like pretty shallow, but just wide enough or something. So you can play games with the magnitudes, and it gets kind of dicey. Whereas if you use a decision tree approach and you require both variables to be beyond the thresholds, then I think we would get a little bit of improved result. But the important thing is that overall, we have the situation where we can recognize that sequences of riffles and pools in which you alternate between wide bar and constricted pool properly can be self-sustaining. Whereas if you're alternating between nozzle and oversized, they won't be self-sustaining. Let me show you some examples. Here are some 2D model results. This is for, looks like it's the base flow example. Blue is low velocity, red is high velocity. Flow is from right to left. And so you can see we start in a really wide, deep section that's oversized. Then we get into a section that's normal channel. And then we get into a section that's nozzle. So this is broadly adhering to our expectations. That as cross-sectional area shrinks, we go through this sequence. Now let me show you an example where the expectations might be a little different from, well, actually, no, actually this is still really much what I would expect, but it's a little more complicated. For sure, constricted pool makes sense. So, constricted pool isn't going to be quite as fast as a nozzle, but we're at 3.1 meters per second. So this is pretty fast. So it's constricted, it's deep, and we have a constricted pool. The place where it's a little confounding is wide bar. So it is not uncommon that here we are at 4 times bankful discharge. Now we're back to a nesting phenomenon. So for this flood flow, we have a flood flow wide bar, but nested within that is a base flow nozzle. So yeah, this matches exactly what I would expect. That is that we don't have to have a uniform velocity across the wide bar. The 2D model is showing us there's more going on here than that simple understanding. But we can use this geomorphic covariance structure analysis and the flow convergence routing landform classification to see that nesting structure. Here's a place where it's not working so well. The constricted pool is as expected, but in this case we have a section that ultimately got classified as nozzle, even though it's wider than the constricted pool. So a nozzle should be narrow and shallow. What's happening in this case is that the narrowness the shallowness is winning. Like it's wide enough that you're getting all these shallow numbers. So these shallow numbers times these deeper numbers on average are making a much shallower cross-section than the constricted pool. And that shallowness is beating the widthness and the product function to turn this into a nozzle. If we use a decision tree approach where both values had to be beyond the 0.5 standard deviation threshold, probably this classification would change. All right, well, we've come pretty far. So I've now explained geomorphic covariance structure theory, and I've showed a little bit of an example. I'm going to pause one more time, and then I'm going to come back, and we're going to start looking at some topographic change results and some other nuances here.